Single dad bus driver helped lost Navy SEALs. They froze when he said, "Call me Lieutenant Shadow," one freezing night. A quiet bus driver stopped for stranded soldiers. But when they begged to know how he saved them so calmly, he whispered the name that made every Navy SEAL in that bus go silent. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The January darkness clung to the small Tennessee town like a heavy blanket. Danny Rhodes stood in his driveway, breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he scraped frost from the windshield of the old yellow school bus. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, the scraper's rhythmic sound cutting through the pre-dawn silence. From the warmth of their modest home, his 17-year-old daughter Faith watched through the window, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders. The soft glow of the porch light caught the concern in her eyes. She lifted her hand in a gentle wave as Danny climbed into the driver's seat. "Be careful out there, Daddy," she called through the partially opened window, her voice carrying across the quiet yard. Danny's face softened into a smile. "Always am, sweetheart. Don't forget your lunch money." The bus's engine rumbled to life, its familiar diesel purr echoing off the surrounding mountains. Danny adjusted his mirrors, checked his gauges, and pulled away from the house. In the rearview mirror, he could see Faith's silhouette still at the window, just like her mother used to do. Emily. The thought of his late wife settled in his chest like a physical weight. She'd always waited by that same window, watching him leave each morning. These quiet dawn hours were when he missed her most. The mountain roads twisted ahead of him, bare trees creating shadowy tunnels in the dim light. Danny hummed softly, an old gospel tune Emily had loved. Amazing Grace filled the empty bus, keeping him company as he navigated the familiar route. "The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want," he sang under his breath, remembering Emily singing those same words while cooking Sunday dinner. Faith had inherited her mother's voice, clear and true. These days, he mostly heard it during church services, when his daughter's voice rose above the congregation, strong and sure like her mother's had been. At the first stop, Mrs. Henderson waited in her usual spot, bundled against the cold. The elderly woman had been riding Danny's bus into town every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 3 years, ever since her arthritis made driving too difficult. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Danny called as she carefully climbed the steps. "Watch your step there. It's mighty slippery." "Bless you, Danny," she replied, settling into her regular seat just behind him. "You're always so thoughtful." "Emily raised you right." Danny's smile was gentle. "That she did, ma'am." More stops brought more familiar faces. The Miller kids, 3 of them, all bundled up like colorful marshmallows, clambered aboard with their backpacks and lunchboxes. Tommy Parker, a high school sophomore who worked part-time at the grocery store, nodded sleepily as he found his usual spot. "Mr. Rhodes," Tommy said, stifling a yawn, "my mama wanted me to thank you again for helping with our truck last week." "Just a loose battery cable, Tommy. Nothing to it." Danny kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was warm. The truth was, he'd spent nearly an hour in the cold, fixing more than just a battery cable, but he'd never mentioned that. As the morning progressed, the bus filled with quiet conversation and the occasional laugh, Danny knew every voice, every story. Mrs. Peterson talking about her grandchildren, Mr. Collins discussing the weather forecast, young Sarah Jenkins practicing her multiplication tables out loud. It wasn't the same as commanding a SEAL team, but there was a similar weight of responsibility. Different stakes, perhaps, but the same duty to keep people safe. The sky remained stubbornly gray, and Danny noticed the first few snowflakes beginning to fall. The weather report had mentioned a possibility of snow, but something about these clouds made him uneasy. He'd learned to read weather patterns during his military years, and these clouds spoke of more than just a light dusting. By the time he finished his morning route and dropped off the last passenger, the snow was falling steadily. Danny pulled into May's Diner, his regular stop for afternoon coffee. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and May herself looked up from behind the counter. "Danny Rhodes, right on schedule," she called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Though with this weather rolling in, I'm surprised you're not headed straight home." "Just a quick cup today, May," he replied, settling onto his usual stool at the counter. The diner was quiet, just a couple of regulars nursing their own coffees and watching the Predator weather through the wide front windows. The small television mounted in the corner suddenly caught everyone's attention as the regular programming cut to a weather alert. The meteorologist's voice was serious as he pointed to a mass of blue and white on the radar. "This system has intensified much faster than expected," the weatherman explained. "We're looking at potentially 6 to 8 inches of snow in the next few hours, with high winds creating near whiteout conditions. We strongly advise all travelers to stay off the roads if possible." Danny's hands tightened around his coffee cup, his mind already calculating. He thought of Mrs. Henderson, who would need to get home from her doctor's appointment, the Miller kids, whose parents both worked late shifts, Tommy Parker, who would be finishing his shift at the grocery store soon. May appeared in front of him, concern etched on her face. "Danny, you've got that look. The same one you had during the flood last spring when you helped evacuate the retirement home." Danny took a slow sip of his coffee, watching the snow fall harder outside the diner's windows. Each flake that added to the growing blanket of white represented another challenge for his passenger's journey home. The responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar weight, much like the tactical gear he'd worn in another life. The weatherman's voice continued to detail the approaching storm's severity, but Danny had already made his decision. These weren't just passengers, they were his people, his community, and he'd never left his people behind. Not in the Navy, and not now. The storm had transformed the familiar streets of their small Tennessee town into a ghostly landscape. Through the windows of Martin's Diner, Danny watched snowflakes dance violently in the headlights of passing cars. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten as he studied the deteriorating conditions outside. Behind the counter, Sarah Martin wiped down surfaces with nervous energy. "Weather Service says it's the worst storm in 20 years, she said, shaking her head. "Roads'll be impossible soon." The bell above the door chimed as Reverend Louise Harper stepped in, snow dusting her silver hair. She brushed off her coat and made her way to Danny's booth, her sensible boots leaving wet prints on the floor. "Thought I might find you here," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. Her kind eyes searched his face. "You've got that look again, Daniel Rhodes." Danny's fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup. "What look is that, Reverend?" "The one that says you're about to do something both brave and foolish." She folded her hands on the table, like checking the routes one more time before this storm really hits. He smiled, despite himself. After 15 years of friendship, the Reverend could read him like one of her beloved hymn books. There might be people stranded out there, folks who need help. "The police are handling it," she said gently. "They can't be everywhere at once." Danny straightened in his seat, decision made. "I know these mountain roads better than anyone. My bus can handle the weather better than their cruisers, too." Reverend Harper studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "The Lord does work in mysterious ways," she said, "and sometimes he sends us into storms to find the lost." Danny stood, reaching for his coat. "I'll just do one quick check of my usual route. Make sure everyone's safe." The Reverend rose too, placing a weathered hand on his arm. "Let me pray for you first." They bowed their heads together as her quiet voice lifted above the howling wind outside. "Lord, guide Daniel's path tonight. Keep him safe as he seeks to help others. Let your light shine through him in this darkness. Amen." "Amen," Danny echoed, feeling steadier for her blessing. 20 minutes later, he was back behind the wheel of his school bus, creeping along the winding mountain road. The headlights barely penetrated the whirling snow, and the wind buffeted the tall vehicle mercilessly. Danny's hands were firm on the wheel, his eyes scanning constantly for any sign of trouble. He'd covered about 5 miles of his route when something caught his attention, a dark shape just visible through the curtain of snow. Danny slowed even further, squinting through the windshield. As he drew closer, his heart rate picked up. A military Humvee lay tilted in the ditch, its front end buried in snow. Thin wisps of smoke rose from under the hood, quickly torn away by the wind. Danny pulled the bus over, positioning it to block as much of the wind as possible. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from under the seat and shrugged into his winter coat. The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow. He waded through knee-deep snow to reach the vehicle, sweeping his flashlight beam across its surface. The sight of the familiar eagle, anchor, and trident emblem made his breath catch. "Navy SEALs, hello," he called out, voice barely carrying over the wind. "Anyone in there?" Movement inside the Humvee. The passenger door creaked open, and a man in combat gear emerged, supporting another who seemed barely conscious. "We need help," the first man shouted. "We've got injuries." Danny was already moving forward. "How many?" "4 total. Thompson's out cold, possible concussion. The rest of us are mobile, but frozen half to death." Danny's old training kicked in automatically. "Get everyone to the bus. It's warm inside. I've got blankets and a first aid kit." He helped support the unconscious man while the others stumbled through the snow. Inside the bus, Danny cranked up the heat and pulled emergency blankets from the storage compartment. "Lay him flat here," he directed, indicating the wide rear seat. "Keep his head and neck stable." His voice had taken on a different quality. Clipped, authoritative, but calm. "You 3, get those wet outer layers off and wrap up in these blankets. Anyone else have injuries I need to know about?" The men exchanged glances as they followed his instructions. The largest of them, sporting a sergeant's stripes, spoke up. "Bumps and bruises mostly. Williams might have a sprained wrist." "Sir, you seem to know what you're doing." Danny was already checking the unconscious man's pupils with his flashlight. Had some experience with this sort of thing. He kept his voice neutral as he continued his assessment. "What's your unit designation?" Another uncertain glance between the conscious men before the sergeant answered. "SEAL Team 4, sir. We were heading back to base after a training exercise when the storm hit. Lost control on the ice." Danny nodded, continuing his methodical check of the injured man. Pupils equal and reactive. Breathing's good. Pulse steady. He looked up at the others. "How long was he out?" "Maybe 10 minutes before you found us." "Good. Keep him warm and monitored. I'm getting you all to the hospital in town." Danny moved back to the driver's seat, his movements precise and efficient. "There's water in that compartment if you need it." "Everyone buckled in?" "Yes, sir," came the automatic response from 3 voices. As Danny carefully maneuvered the bus back onto the road, he could feel their curious stares. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was racing. It had been years since he'd used those old instincts, that command voice. Years since he'd thought about his own time with the SEALs. The storm raged outside, but inside the bus, the heat slowly brought color back to frozen faces. Danny kept one eye on his passengers in the rear-view mirror as he navigated the treacherous road, watching as they huddled under the blankets, occasionally checking on their unconscious teammate. Inside the parked school bus, warmth from the portable heater gradually pushed back the bitter cold. 6 Navy SEALs huddled around it, their combat gear crusted with snow and ice. Danny moved with quiet efficiency, setting up his small camping stove on a cleared space near the front of the bus. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Snow had already begun to pile up against the sides of the bus, creating a cocoon of white. Danny poured water from his thermos into a beaten aluminum pot, measuring out instant coffee with steady hands. "Anyone have injuries that need immediate attention?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. The familiar scent of coffee began to fill the space. Commander Henderson, a weathered man in his late 30s, spoke up. Martinez took a bad fall when our vehicle slid. Possible concussion. Watson's got a gash on his arm. Danny nodded, reaching for his first aid kit. He knelt beside Martinez, who sat slumped against a window, and checked his pupils with a small flashlight. His movements were precise. Practiced. "Follow my finger," Danny instructed, moving it slowly left to right. "Any nausea? Dizziness?" Martinez blinked, slowly. "Both. Everything's spinning a bit." "Mild concussion," Danny confirmed. "We'll need to keep you awake for a while." He turned to Watson, examining the bloody tear in his sleeve. "This needs cleaning and stitches, but I can butterfly it for now." Commander Henderson watched Danny work, his expression thoughtful. "You seem to know your way around field medicine, Mr. Rhodes." Danny kept his eyes on Watson's wound as he cleaned it. "Just Danny is fine. And you pick things up here and there. Used to be around folks who needed it." He applied the butterfly bandages with practiced precision. "That's some professional-grade first aid for picking things up," Henderson observed. Danny shrugged, standing to pour the coffee into paper cups. "Roads get dangerous out here in winter. Better to know how to help than wish you did." He passed out the steaming cups, making sure Martinez got his first. The youngest of the group, Sergeant Mike Keller, hadn't taken his eyes off Danny since they'd boarded. He sat slightly apart from the others, his posture tense despite his exhaustion. "You military?" he asked abruptly. "Just a bus driver," Danny replied, his voice neutral. He checked the heater's fuel level and adjusted it slightly. "Funny," Keller continued, his tone sharp. "You haven't asked us once what we're doing out here. Most civilians would be curious about a special operations team in the middle of nowhere." The other SEALs shifted uncomfortably. Commander Henderson shot Keller a warning look, but Danny seemed unperturbed. "Figure if you wanted me to know, you'd tell me," he said simply, checking Martinez's pupils again. One of the other SEALs, Thompson, chuckled. "Man's got a point, Keller. Not everyone needs to know everyone's business." Danny moved to the front of the bus, checking the radio he'd been trying to reach emergency services with. Still, nothing but static. The storm was blocking signals. He turned back to the group. "We should set up rotating shifts," he said. "2 men awake at all times. Better for security, and it'll help conserve body heat if some of you can sleep. Martinez needs someone monitoring him anyway." Keller stood up suddenly. "How do you know about rotating shifts, Mike?" Henderson warned, but Keller pressed on. "No, sir. Look at him. The way he moves. How he assessed the situation when he found us. The medical training. He knew our hand signals when he approached the vehicle. He's using our protocols." A heavy silence fell over the bus. Danny continued his tasks, seemingly unbothered by the accusation. He checked the windows for draft, sealed a gap with some tape from his kit. "Sir," Keller said quietly to Henderson, not taking his eyes off Danny. "He's not just a bus driver." Commander Henderson studied Danny carefully. The older man moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long training, every action deliberate and precise. His calm in crisis, his immediate assessment of injuries, the way he'd naturally taken charge while still deferring to Henderson's authority, it all painted a picture that didn't match the simple story of a small-town bus driver. Danny finished his inspection of the windows and turned back to the group. "First shift, Commander?" he asked, as if Keller's words hadn't landed like stones in still water. Henderson nodded slowly. "Thompson, you're with me. Watson, get some rest. You've lost blood. Martinez needs to stay awake. Keller, keep him talking. The rest of you, try to sleep." As the men arranged themselves, some stretching out on the bus seats while others remained vigilant, Keller leaned close to Henderson. "He's military," Keller whispered. "Special operations, maybe even one of us. No civilian moves like that, sir. No civilian knows what he knows." Gray morning light filtered through the snow-covered windows of the bus. The storm showed no signs of letting up, its howling wind a constant reminder of their predicament. Danny stood at the front, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel as he checked the fuel gauge. They had enough to keep the engine running for warmth, but not much more. Behind him, the SEALs spoke in hushed tones, their breath visible in the cold air despite the heater's efforts. Sergeant Mike Keller sat apart from the others, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his phone screen. His fingers moved with purpose, searching through old recordings. Keller called out to Commander Henderson. "I'm trying to find that emergency frequency we used in Kuwait." He scrolled through audio files, his frustration evident. "Maybe we can boost the signal somehow." Static crackled through the phone's speaker as Keller played through various recordings. Danny half listened while checking the engine temperature, making sure it wouldn't freeze. Then, through the white noise, a clear voice cut through. "This is Echo 7 calling Lieutenant Shadow. Come in, Shadow." Without thinking, Danny's head snapped up. "Echo 7. This is Shadow. Status Rep." He caught himself mid-sentence, but it was too late. The bus fell silent. 6 pairs of eyes locked onto Danny, who stood frozen at the wheel. Even the wind seemed to pause. Commander Henderson rose slowly from his seat, his face pale. "What did you just say?" Danny's shoulders slumped, the weight of a decade-old secret finally catching up to him. He turned around slowly, facing the men. "You're Lieutenant Shadow?" Henderson's voice trembled with disbelief. "The Shadow? From Falcon Reach?" The other SEALs straightened in their seats. Even the youngest among them knew that name. It was part of their training, part of their legacy. Danny's weathered face showed every year of the burden he'd carried. He looked down at his hands, bus driver's hands now. But they still remembered the weight of different responsibilities. He corrected quietly. "I was Lieutenant Shadow. But you disappeared," one of the younger SEALs whispered. "After Falcon Reach, you just vanished." Danny finished. He moved to sit heavily in the driver's seat, turning it to face the men. "Because good men died that day. Men under my command. My best friend." His voice caught. Henderson shook his head in amazement. "Sir, your tactics are still taught at basic. The Shadow protocol for night insertions. That was you. You're a legend. I'm a bus driver," Danny corrected firmly.
"Have been for 8 years now."
After Falcon Reach, after losing Marcus. He paused, looking directly at Keller, whose face had grown increasingly tense. "After your father died under my command, Mike, I couldn't. I had a little girl who needed me more than the Navy did." Keller's knuckles went white around his phone. The other SEALs glanced between him and Danny, the connection suddenly clear. "I resigned my commission," Danny continued. "Found this town, bought a bus route, built something quiet for Faith. That's my daughter. Something safe. His eyes carried the weight of memories he usually kept locked away. The man you're thinking of, Lieutenant Shadow. He died in those mountains, with Marcus Keller and the others." Before anyone could respond, the bus's radio crackled to life. "Dad?" Faith's voice filled the space, warm and worried. "Dad, are you okay? The storm's getting worse in town." The transformation was immediate. Danny's face softened, the hard lines of memory melting away as he reached for the radio. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Got some passengers waiting out the storm with me. We're all safe and warm. Did you remember to take your heart medicine? And there's soup in the blue thermos." A gentle smile crossed Danny's face. "Yes, to both. Don't worry about me, Faith. Say a prayer for us if you would." "Already did, Dad. Love you." "Love you too, honey." The radio fell silent. The contrast between the legendary Lieutenant Shadow and this tender father figure hung in the air. Commander Henderson's lips curved in a small smile. "Guess even heroes retire," he said softly. But Keller's jaw tightened, his eyes hard. "Not everyone can forget the dead, sir." Morning crept over the mountains, the storm's fury finally giving way to gentle snowfall. Inside the bus, the engine's steady hum provided a comforting backdrop to the quiet conversations of exhausted men. Danny stood at the small camp stove he kept for emergencies, carefully heating water for coffee and reconstituting military rations from the SEALs' packs. "Anyone allergic to anything?" Danny asked, sorting through the foil packets. His hands moved with familiar efficiency, testament to years of field experience. "Just bad coffee, sir," one of the younger SEALs joked, earning tired chuckles from his teammates. Danny smiled, stirring the heating meals. "Well, I can't promise this'll be much better, but it'll be hot." He began passing out steaming cups and plates, making sure everyone got their share. Commander Henderson watched Danny work, noting how naturally he fell into the role of caring for a team. "You know," Hawk said softly, "they still talk about you at training. The way you'd always make sure your men ate first, even in the worst conditions." Danny paused, his movements becoming more measured. "Old habits," he murmured, but his eyes carried a distant look. "Learned that lesson early. A hungry team is a vulnerable team." Was that before or after Falcon Reach? Mike Keller's voice cut through the quiet conversation, sharp as a knife. The other SEALs shifted uncomfortably. Danny turned to face Mike, his expression carefully neutral. "Before," he answered quietly. "Your fall." He caught himself, not yet realizing the connection. "Marcus taught me that, actually, back in our first year together." "Marcus?" Mike stood up slowly, his breakfast forgotten. "You say his name like you knew him." Commander Henderson started to rise. "Keller." Mike cut him off, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "I want to hear him say it. Tell me about Marcus. Tell me about the man you left behind." Danny's face paled as understanding dawned. He looked at Mike, really looked at him for the first time, and saw Marcus in the set of his jaw, the fire in his eyes. "You're Marcus's boy," he breathed, the words barely audible. The bus grew deathly quiet. Even the engine's hum seemed muted. "Yeah," Mike's voice cracked. "I'm Marcus Keller's son, the son who grew up without a father because his commander, the great Lieutenant Shadow, failed him when it mattered most." Danny set down the pot he was holding, his hands suddenly unsteady. "Mike, don't." Mike's face contorted with fury and grief. "Don't you dare try to explain. You gotta walk away. You gotta have a life with your daughter while my father—" His voice broke. "While my father died in those mountains." "It wasn't like that," Danny said softly, pain etching deep lines around his eyes. "Marcus was my best friend. I tried." "Tried?" Mike laughed bitterly. "Is that what helps you sleep at night? Telling yourself you tried while you live your peaceful little life driving kids to school?" "Keller, stand down," Commander Henderson ordered, but Mike was beyond hearing. "You don't deserve peace," Mike shouted, backing toward the bus door. "You don't deserve any of this." He yanked the door open, letting in a blast of cold air and swirling snow. "Mike, wait." Danny moved to follow him. "Stay away from me." Mike jumped down into the snow, his boots crunching in the fresh powder. "You're not half the man my father was." Danny followed him out into the cold, leaving the other SEALs watching in stunned silence through the bus windows. The snow had lightened enough to see clearly, the dawn painting everything in shades of pink and gray. "Mike, please," Danny called out, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Let me explain what happened." Mike whirled around, his face wet with more than just snow. Explain how you left him behind? How you failed to help my father when his life was in danger?" The words hit Danny like physical blows. He stood there in the snow, the weight of a decade's worth of guilt pressing down on him. All the carefully constructed walls of his new life crumbled in the face of Marcus's son, the living reminder of his greatest failure. "You're right," Danny whispered, his voice raw. "I failed him. I failed you both." The revelation hung between them in the cold morning air. The man Danny had saved from the storm was the son of the man he couldn't save all those years ago. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thinning clouds, casting weak shadows across the snow-covered ground. Inside the bus, the atmosphere was as heavy as the blanket of white outside. Commander Henderson stood near the middle of the bus, his arms crossed, while his team huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. "We should call for extraction now. That the storm's letting up," one of the younger SEALs suggested, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Hawk shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "The roads are still dangerous. We'd be putting more lives at risk." "I agree," Danny said quietly from his position at the driver's seat. "These mountain passes can be treacherous, even after the snow stops. Best to wait until the plows come through." The radio crackled to life, cutting through the tension. "Dad, are you there?" Faith's worried voice filled the bus. Danny reached for the radio, his face softening instantly. "I'm here, sweetheart. Everything's okay. The news says the storm's moving out. Are you coming home soon?" "As soon as it's safe," Danny assured her, his voice gentle. "Did you remember to feed Shadow?" He smiled slightly at using the name of their black cat, now an unintended reminder of his past identity. "Of course. I made hot chocolate too. There's plenty when you get back." "That's my girl. I'll check in again soon." Danny set the radio down, aware of the SEALs watching him with mixed expressions. Mike Keller sat alone at the back of the bus, his body rigid with barely contained anger. While the others talked, he pulled out his satellite phone, fingers moving quickly across the keypad. His message was brief but clear. "Request immediate background check. Daniel Rhodes, former Lieutenantese Even Menet. Commander, possible connection to Falcon Reach incident." Danny noticed Mike's isolation but didn't approach him. Instead, he turned back to face the windshield, closing his eyes. His lips moved in silent prayer, remembering Reverend Harper's words from the previous evening. "Sometimes God sends us into storms to find the lost." He hadn't understood then how literal those words would become. "Lord," he whispered, "give me strength to face what's coming. Help me find the right words." The other SEALs continued their quiet discussions about extraction plans and protocols, but Danny could feel the underlying current of uncertainty. They were trained for combat, for crisis situations. But this was different. A collision of past and present that no one had expected. Hawk approached Danny's seat, speaking low enough that only they could hear. "Whatever happened on that mission, Lieutenant, there are always two sides to every story." Danny's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Sometimes both sides are equally painful, Commander." The morning light grew stronger as the storm clouds continued to disperse. The wind died down to occasional gusts, revealing patches of blue sky. The SEALs began checking their gear and communications equipment, preparing for eventual extraction. Suddenly, a deep boom echoed through the valley. Everyone jerked to attention. Through the clearing air, they could see black smoke rising from where they'd left the disabled Humvee. "Fuel line must have finally gone," Hawk said, reaching for his radio. "That smoke will lead rescue right to us." Mike stood up, abruptly, his face set in hard lines. He moved to the front of the bus, positioning himself directly behind Danny's seat. "Before they get here," he said, his voice tight with emotion, "you and I need to talk about my father." Danny turned slowly in his seat, meeting Mike's gaze. The younger man's eyes held years of pain and questions, mirrors of the guilt Danny had carried for so long. "I need to know the truth," Mike continued, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "All of it. No more hiding behind this bus driver act." The other SEALs tensed, ready to intervene if needed, but Hawk held up a hand, keeping them back. This was a confrontation that had been brewing for years, even if neither man had known it until now. Through the windshield, they could see the smoke signal rising higher into the clearing sky. Somewhere in the distance, rescue teams would be mobilizing, following that dark beacon to their location. But for now, time seemed suspended in the bus, as father and son, one lost, one found, prepared to face the ghosts that had haunted them both for a decade. Danny nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable. "You deserve that much," he said quietly. "Your father deserved more than what happened that day." The sound of distant helicopters began to echo off the mountains, but neither man moved. The real storm was just beginning, and this one couldn't be waited out. The afternoon sun glinted off the endless white landscape as Danny's old pickup truck led the way down the winding road, the SEALs following in their rescue vehicle. His modest two-story farmhouse came into view, its weathered blue paint and wraparound porch, a welcome sight after the long night. Faith stood on the porch, wrapped in her mother's old quilted jacket, her eyes wide as the military vehicle pulled up behind her father's truck. She tucked a strand of brown hair behind her ear, watching nervously as the men emerged. "I made vegetable soup," she called out, her voice carrying across the crisp air. "And there's fresh coffee brewing." Danny climbed the porch steps, giving his daughter a quick hug. "Thanks, sweetheart. These men could use some warming up." He turned to the group. "It's not much, but you're welcome to stay until your transport arrives." Commander Henderson nodded gratefully. "We appreciate it, sir." The respect in his voice was unmistakable, even though Danny was no longer his superior. Inside, the farmhouse was humble but homey. Family photos lined the walls, and a well-worn Bible sat open on the coffee table. The smell of soup and fresh bread filled the air, mixing with the lingering scent of pine from the Christmas tree they hadn't yet taken down. The younger SEALs gathered in the living room, sinking into the comfortable furniture with visible relief. But Mike Keller remained near the door, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the room like he was in hostile territory. Faith ladled soup into mismatched bowls, passing them around with warm bread. "I hope it's okay," she said softly. "It's my mom's recipe." "It's perfect, miss," Hawk said, accepting a bowl. "Your father's been nothing but kind to us." Mike scoffed quietly, but accepted the food when offered. His gaze drifted to the photos on the wall, freezing when he spotted one particular frame. He set his bowl down and walked closer. The photograph showed a younger Danny in desert fatigues, arm thrown around another soldier's shoulders. Both men were grinning despite the harsh environment, their faces streaked with dust, but eyes bright with brotherhood. Mike's hands trembled as he lifted the frame from the wall. The other man in the photo was unmistakably his father, Marcus Keller. Faith noticed his reaction. "Are you okay, sir?" Mike's jaw clenched. He turned the photo toward Danny, who had gone very still. "So it wasn't just a rumor. You were there, with him, before." The room fell silent. The other SEALs shifted uncomfortably, aware of the building tension. Faith looked between them, confusion and concern crossing her face. She touched her father's arm. "Dad?" Danny's eyes were fixed on the photograph, lost in memories he'd tried so hard to bury. "Could you all excuse us for a moment?" he asked quietly. The other SEALs nodded, following Hawk into the kitchen. Faith stayed, her hand still on her father's arm. "What is it? What happened in the war?" Danny sank into his old armchair, the weight of the past settling heavy on his shoulders. "That man in the photo," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "was Marcus Keller, my best friend, Mike's father." He looked up at his daughter, tears gathering in his eyes. "We were on a mission, Operation Falcon Reach. Everything went wrong. The intel was bad. We were surrounded." Faith knelt beside her father's chair, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. "I gave the order to push forward," Danny continued, a tear sliding down his weathered cheek. "I thought we could break through. But They were, waiting for us. Marcus, he saw the trap before I did. He pushed our men back, covered their retreat. He saved them. But, his voice broke, one wrong call, one wrong order, and good men died. Marcus died. Unknown to them, Mike stood in the doorway, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The bowl of soup crashed to the floor as he slammed his hand against the doorframe. "You don't deserve forgiveness," he spat, his words cutting through the quiet room like shards of ice. Faith flinched at the sudden violence, pressing closer to her father. Danny didn't move, his expression hollow, the old wound torn open, fresh and bleeding. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, the warmth of the house now feeling like a mockery of the cold truth that had emerged. Evening settled over the Rhodes farmhouse like a heavy blanket, the last rays of sunlight fading behind snow-covered mountains. In the living room, the crackle of the fireplace mixed with the soft whisper of Faith's voice as she read from her worn Bible, her words offering gentle comfort to the weary men scattered around the room. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," Faith read, her voice steady and clear. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, warming the space that felt both crowded and oddly empty. Danny had given up his bedroom to Peterson, the wounded SEAL, who needed proper rest. The others made themselves comfortable on spare mattresses and the couch, their gear neatly stacked in corners. The house smelled of coffee and the stew Faith had made, mixing with the pine scent of the burning logs. Commander Henderson, MDN, Hawk, sat in the old armchair by the window, his weathered face thoughtful as he watched the snow fall outside. The younger SEALs, Martinez and Thompson, played cards quietly on the floor, while Mike Keller stood rigid by the mantel, his stance tense as a drawn bow. "Remember that night in Kandahar?" Martinez said suddenly, breaking the silence. "When Lieutenant Cooper got his pants caught on that fence?" Thompson chuckled. "Man, the locals didn't stop laughing for days." The memories flowed then. Stories of missions and brotherhood, of close calls and closer friendships. Danny listened from his spot near the kitchen doorway, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his expression unreadable. Hawk stood slowly and made his way over to Danny. "You know," he said quietly, "they still tell stories about Shadow at the base. How you got those civilians out of that compound in '08. Saved hundreds of lives that day." Danny's fingers tightened on his mug. "That was another life. You were a hero, sir. Still are to many." "A man doesn't outrun ghosts by changing uniforms, Commander," Danny replied, his voice low and rough. "Sometimes the uniform just hides the scars better." From across the room, Mike's bitter laugh cut through the air like broken glass. "Hiding. That's what you're good at, isn't it, Lieutenant?" He pushed away from the mantel, his young face twisted with anger. "Running away, leaving others to clean up your mess. Keller," Hawk warned. But Mike wasn't finished. "You abandoned everything, your duty, your men." Mike's voice rose. "You didn't even come to his funeral." The room went silent, except for Faith's sharp intake of breath. Danny set his mug down carefully, his movements measured. "You don't understand, son. Don't call me that." Mike lunged forward, his fists clenched. "You don't have the right!" Hawk moved quickly between them. "Stand down, Sergeant!" But Mike's pain had found its target. "My father trusted you. He followed you into that mission, and you left him there. That's enough." Faith's voice rang out as she stood, her Bible clutched to her chest. The room froze at her unexpected authority. Despite her youth, she faced Mike with unwavering courage. "You're hurting," she said softly. "I understand that. I lost my mother when I was 12, and some days that pain feels fresh as yesterday." Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained strong. "But pain doesn't give you the right to judge what you don't know. My father carries his own wounds, ones you can't see." Mike's jaw worked, emotion warring across his face. "You don't know what happened." "No," Faith agreed. But I know my father. I know the man who gets up every morning to drive children safely to school, who stops to help strangers in snowstorms, who prays every night for the many lost. She took a step closer to Mike. That's not a man who runs from duty. That's a man who found a different way to serve. The tension in the room shifted, became something softer, more fragile. Danny looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and pain, seeing so much of Emily in her strength. Without a word, he turned and walked out the front door into the crisp night air. The snow crunched under his boots as he made his way to the old oak tree in the yard. Stars sparkled overhead, cold and distant in the clear winter sky. "I thought I left war behind, Em," he whispered to the night, to his wife's memory. "But maybe war never left me." The stars offered no answer, only their eternal light, shining down on the snow-covered world below. Morning light painted the snow-covered landscape in gentle hues of pink and gold. The world seemed impossibly quiet after yesterday's tensions, broken only by the soft crunch of footsteps on the wooden porch. Danny sat in his old rocking chair, shoulders hunched against the morning chill, his weathered hands clasped together as if in perpetual prayer. Faith pushed open the screen door, careful not to let it slam. Steam rose from 2 coffee mugs in her hands, dancing in the crisp air. Her father's eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains, but his expression softened at her approach. "You're up early," she said, offering him one of the mugs. The ceramic was warm against his cold fingers. "Never really slept," Danny admitted, taking a careful sip. The coffee was exactly how he liked it. Black, with just a hint of sugar. Sometimes it amazed him how well his daughter knew him. Faith settled onto the porch step in front of him, wrapping her hands around her own mug. Her long brown hair caught the morning light, reminding Danny so much of her mother that his chest ached. "You know what I think?" she said after a moment. "I think God doesn't waste broken stories." Danny's rocking slowed. "Faith. No, listen." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with conviction. "All these years, you've carried this weight, and now these men show up in a snowstorm of all things, and one of them is connected to your past? That's not coincidence, Dad. Maybe he sent them here to heal you." Danny studied his coffee, watching his reflection ripple in the dark liquid. His daughter's faith had always been stronger than his own. Clearer, purer, unmarred by the shadows he'd seen. But there was wisdom in her words that touched something deep within him. "When did you get so wise?" he asked softly. "Mom always said, I got it from you." Faith's smile was gentle. "Will you at least try? Come help them with the bus today. The road should be clear enough to get them into town." Danny nodded slowly, feeling something shift inside him, like ice beginning to thaw. Yeah, I will." Inside the house, the Seals were already awake, moving with the quiet efficiency of men used to early mornings. Hawk looked up from his coffee as Danny entered, offering a respectful nod. The younger men straightened instinctively, military bearing showing through despite their civilian clothes. "Road should be passable now," Danny said, his voice steady. "I'll drive you folks into town, help you connect with your base." "Appreciate that, sir," Hawk replied, and Danny noticed he didn't correct the "sir" this time. They moved outside as a group, boots crunching through fresh snow, to where the yellow school bus sat waiting. Danny popped the hood, and soon the men fell into an easy rhythm of maintenance work. Matthews, the youngest Seal, handed tools to Danny while Johnson checked the tires. Even Hawk got his hands dirty, helping to change the oil. The familiar work created a comfortable silence, broken only by occasional requests for tools or quiet technical discussion. It was the language of men who understood machinery and teamwork, where words weren't always necessary. Mike Keller stood apart, leaning against the farmhouse wall. His eyes tracked Danny's movements, the way he worked with precise, practiced motions. how he showed the same patience teaching Matthews about the engine as he had once shown young SEALs in training. There was no pride in Danny's demeanor, no attempt to prove himself or demand respect. He was simply there, serving quietly, as he had done every day on his bus route. The morning wore on, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension began to ease. When Danny struggled with a stubborn bolt, it was Mike who stepped forward with a better wrench, their eyes meeting briefly as he handed it over. No words were exchanged, but something shifted in that moment. A hairline crack in the wall of anger. Faith brought out sandwiches and more coffee at noon, and they ate together in the weak winter sun. The conversation was sparse but no longer strained, focusing on practical matters like weather reports and road conditions. Danny shared his knowledge of the mountain passes, and the SEALs listened with the respect due to local expertise. As dusk approached, casting long shadows across the snow, the bus was ready. Faith had prepared a simple dinner, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, the smell filling the house with warmth. Before they ate, Danny cleared his throat softly. "If you don't mind," he said, "in this house, we say grace before meals." The SEALs glanced at each other, then at Mike. For a moment, the old tension threatened to return, but then Hawk bowed, his head, followed by the others. Mike hesitated, his jaw working silently. Then, slowly, he too lowered his head. Danny's voice was quiet but clear in the stillness. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for shelter from the storm, and for bringing these men to our table. Guide us all in your wisdom and grace. Amen." "Amen," the others murmured, and for the first time since the storm had brought them together, true peace settled over the Rhodes household. 2 days had passed since the storm, and the morning sun finally pierced through the lingering clouds. The roads, though still dotted with patches of ice, were deemed safe enough for travel. Danny Rhodes stood in his driveway, watching as Commander Hawk and his team loaded their gear into the old yellow school bus. Faith hugged her worn Bible close to her chest, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. "Dad, can I come with you, just to say goodbye properly in town?" Danny nodded, a gentle smile crossing his weathered face. Of course, sweetheart. But bundle up. It's still cold out there." Inside the bus, the atmosphere was different from the tense silence of days before. The SEALs chatted quietly among themselves, their military bearing somewhat relaxed by their time in the Rhodes home. Even Mike Keller seemed less rigid, though he still kept his distance, choosing a seat near the back. "All aboard," Danny called out, his bus driver's routine feeling strange with this particular group of passengers. Faith settled into her usual spot behind him, and he could see her in the rearview mirror, sneaking glances at the elite warriors who filled the seats behind her. The bus rumbled to life, its familiar diesel engine growling against the mountain silence. Danny guided it carefully along the winding road, years of experience evident in every smooth turn and gentle brake. The elevation climbed steadily as they approached the mountain pass, snow-laden pines swaying gently in the winter breeze. "Beautiful country up here," Hawk commented from his seat, breaking the quiet. "Different kind of battlefield." Danny nodded, his hands steady on the wheel. "Nature's got its own rules of engagement. You learn to respect them, or—" A deep rumble cut through his words, making the bus windows vibrate. Faith grabbed the seat in front of her, her eyes wide. "Dad?" Danny's SEAL instincts kicked in before his mind could process what was happening. His eyes darted to the slope above them, where a massive wall of white was beginning to move. The warming temperatures had weakened the snowpack, and now tons of snow and rock were breaking free. "Avalanche!" Hawk shouted, but Danny was already acting. He yanked the wheel hard, pulling the bus onto a wider section of road just as the first wave of snow crashed past them. Through the swirling white, Danny spotted something that made his heart sink. The Peterson family farmhouse, where he knew several families had gathered to help with storm cleanup. "There are people in that house," he said, his voice shifting from bus driver to Lieutenant Shadow in an instant. "Hawk, What's your team's gear situation? Basic rescue equipment, sir. Ropes, first aid, emergency supplies. Danny didn't hesitate. Faith, radio dispatch. Tell them we need emergency services at the Peterson farm. His daughter nodded, already reaching for the radio. SEALs, move out. Civilians first. That's our priority. The transformation was immediate. The team snapped to attention, gathering their gear with practiced efficiency. Danny led them through the deepening snow toward the farmhouse, where panicked voices could be heard over the rumble of shifting earth. Keller, take point on the west side, Danny ordered, falling naturally into command. Hawk, east entrance. The rest of you, form a rescue line. We need to get those people out before another rumble shook the ground. Part of the roof was starting to crack under the weight of accumulated snow and debris. Move. Move! Move! Danny shouted. They worked with precision, getting the trapped families out one by one. An elderly couple, 3 young children, their parents. The SEALs formed a human chain through the dangerous terrain, passing people to safety. Faith stayed by the bus, helping the rescued civilians inside where it was warm and secure. Mike Keller proved his SEAL training, moving with speed and skill. For a moment, the tension between him and Danny seemed forgotten in the urgency of the rescue. That's the last of them, Hawk called out. Danny was doing a final sweep of the house when he heard it, a child's whimper from a back room. He pushed through the groaning building, finding a small boy huddled under a bed. Come on, son, he said gently, reaching out. Let's get you to safety. To his surprise, Mike appeared beside him. Sir, we need to move. The structure's failing. Danny nodded, handing the child to Mike. Get him out. I'm right behind you. They made their way toward the exit, but the house was shuddering around them. Danny could hear the wood splintering above, the weight of snow and rock becoming too much for the old farmhouse to bear. Mike got the boy to the doorway just as a massive support beam began to give way. Danny saw it falling and acted on instinct, pushing Mike and the child forward with all his strength. The last thing he remembered was the crashing sound of timber and Mike's startled shout before the world disappeared into white darkness, cold. The weight of snow and splintered wood pressed down like a frozen tomb. Danny Rhodes couldn't move, but he could feel Mike Keller's body beneath his own, shielding the younger man from the collapsed beam that had caught them both. The bitter taste of copper filled his mouth, and his breaths came in sharp, painful gasps that turned to white mist in the freezing air. Through the haze of pain, memories crashed over him like waves. Not of the present, but of that day 10 years ago, the failed mission that had changed everything. Lieutenant, we're taking heavy fire. Marcus's voice echoed in his mind, clear as day. The sound of gunfire, the smell of smoke and sand. Danny squeezed his eyes shut, but the memories wouldn't stop. He was back there, in that burning compound, watching his best friend run toward the trapped civilians. Marcus, wait, he had shouted. That's an order. But Marcus Keller had known what Danny knew. There wasn't time for protocol, not with innocent lives at stake. Someone's got to do it, Shadow, Marcus had said, that familiar half-smile on his face. Take care of my boy if I don't make it. Then the explosion, the searing light, the silence. Now, buried under the avalanche's debris, Danny felt tears freezing on his cheeks. He had tried to follow Marcus that day, to save him, but the secondary explosion had knocked him back. By the time he reached his friend, it was too late. Dad? Mike's voice cut through the memories, weak and muffled. Danny, stay. Danny managed, tasting blood. Help's coming. Mike shifted beneath him, realizing Danny was using his own body to keep the beam from crushing them both. Why? Mike's voice cracked. After everything I said, why risk your life for me? Because, Danny whispered, I promised your father. Through the small pocket of space between them, Mike could see Danny's face in the dim light filtering through the snow. The older man's eyes were distant, lost in the past. I can still hear him, Danny continued, his voice growing weaker. Your father. He knew. He knew what would happen. But he went in anyway, to save those families. Mike's breath caught in his throat. What? What do you mean? I tried to stop him. Tried to go instead. Danny coughed, and Mike felt something warm drip onto his chest. Blood. But he was faster. Said someone had to do it. Made me promise to look after you. The truth hit Mike like a physical blow. All these years, he'd believed Danny had abandoned his father, had given the order that killed him. But now, lying in the frozen darkness, he saw it clearly. Danny had tried to save Marcus, had tried to take his place. With trembling hands, Mike began clawing at the snow around them. Hold on, he said, his voice thick with tears. Just hold on. Above them, they could hear muffled shouts. The other SEALs were searching. Mike dug faster, ignoring the pain in his frozen fingers. I'm sorry, Danny whispered. Should have found you. After. Should have kept my promise better. No, Mike choked out. I'm the one who's sorry. I blamed you. God, I blamed you for so long. Light suddenly broke through as hands appeared, clearing away debris. Hawk's voice called down to them. We've got them. Over here. The next few minutes were a blur of movement and voices. The SEALs worked with practiced efficiency, carefully lifting the beam off Danny. When they pulled him free, his body was limp. His lips tinged blue. Faith's scream cut through the winter air as she ran toward them. Daddy! No, please, Daddy! Mike caught her before she could fall, holding her as the medics worked on Danny. The sound of a helicopter grew louder, breaking through the mountain silence. Snow swirled around them as the rescue chopper descended. Mike watched as they loaded Danny onto a stretcher. Faith's sobs muffled against his chest. The girl who had shown such strength, such faith in everyone around her, now seemed so small and fragile. Mike sank to his knees beside her, his own tears finally flowing freely. He saved me, he whispered, the words catching in his throat, just like my father would have. He saved me. The helicopter's rotors whipped the snow into a blinding curtain as the medics secured Danny for transport. Faith clung to Mike's arm, her prayer barely audible above the noise. Please, God, please don't take him too. All the anger, all the blame Mike had carried for so long melted away, like snow in sunlight. In its place was understanding and the crushing weight of regret for the years he'd spent hating the man who had only ever tried to honor his father's last wish. The hospital corridor was quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the squeaking of nurses' shoes on polished floors. Outside the window, snowflakes drifted lazily past, glowing orange in the parking lot lights. The clock on the wall read 9:47 p.m., but time seemed to have lost all meaning in the sterile whiteness of the ICU. Faith Rhodes sat beside her father's bed, her small hand wrapped around his larger one. The steady beep of the heart monitor marked each second, while tubes and wires created a maze around Danny's still form. His face was pale against the white sheets, a bandage wrapped around his head where he'd been struck by falling debris. Reverend Louise Harper sat on the other side of the bed, her weathered Bible open in her lap. She hadn't read from it yet. Sometimes, silence was its own kind of prayer. Her wise eyes moved between Faith and Danny, watching, waiting, hoping. He looked so small, Faith whispered, her voice rough from crying. She'd never seen her father look vulnerable before. Even after long days driving the bus route, he'd always seemed strong, unshakable. Now, with machines breathing for him, that illusion was shattered. Outside in the hallway, Commander Henderson, Hawk, stood with his back against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. His men sat in plastic chairs or paced the corridor, still in their snow-dusted uniforms. None of them wanted to leave, even though visiting hours had technically ended. The nurses had taken one look at their faces and decided not to enforce the rules. Faith tucked her father's blanket higher around his chest, careful not to disturb any of the monitoring equipment. "Remember when I was sick last winter?" she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "You stayed up 3 nights straight, making soup and telling me stories about Mom." Her voice caught. "You never left my side, not once." Reverend Harper reached across the bed and squeezed Faith's shoulder. "Your father has the biggest heart of anyone I know," she said. "The Lord doesn't waste good hearts." Through the window in the door, they could see Mike Keller walking past, his face haunted. He'd been wandering between the chapel and the ICU for hours, unable to settle. The weight of truth and regret seemed to bend his shoulders. Hawk quietly entered the room, his presence somehow making the space feel safer. He stood at the foot of Danny's bed, looking down at the man who had become a legend among SEALs. "You know," he said gently to Faith, "when I was going through Bud S training, that's our basic training, the instructors would tell us stories about Lieutenant Shadow, about impossible missions he led, lives he saved." He smiled faintly. "We thought they were exaggerating, making up tales to inspire us. But meeting your father," he shook his head, "the stories didn't do him justice." Faith looked up, tears shining in her eyes. "He never talks about that time, never tells those stories." "That's because true heroes rarely do," Hawk replied. "They carry the weight of their choices quietly, focus on helping others, instead of seeking glory." He gestured toward the hallway. "Every man out there owes your father a debt, not just for today, but for showing us what real leadership looks like. Putting others first, no matter the cost." The door opened again, and Mike slipped in. His eyes were red-rimmed, his uniform wrinkled from hours of restless movement. He'd been in the chapel, kneeling on the hard floor until his knees ached, trying to find words for everything churning inside him. "I made a promise," he announced quietly. The others turned to look at him. "In the chapel, I promised God and my father that I'd make this right." He moved closer to Danny's bed, his hands clenched at his claws. "Sides. Lieutenant Shadow's name, your father's name, it deserves honor, not hatred. I was wrong. So wrong." Faith stood, and without hesitation, wrapped her arms around Mike. He stiffened for a moment, then hugged her back, his shoulders shaking slightly. "He forgave you already," Faith murmured. "Even before today. That's who he is." Reverend Harper closed her Bible and stood. "That's who Christ calls us to be," she added softly. "Forgiving others, as we have been forgiven." She looked meaningfully at Mike. "Your father would be proud of you right now, son." A nurse appeared in the doorway with fresh IV bags. As she worked, checking Danny's vitals and adjusting his medication, Faith returned to her chair. She held her father's hand again, running her thumb over his calloused knuckles. Hands that had held rifles and steering wheels, wiped away tears, and built a home for a grieving daughter. "Come back to me, Daddy," she whispered. "I'm not ready to be brave without you yet." The room fell silent, except for the steady rhythm of machines. Snow continued to fall outside, coating the world in clean white. Minutes stretched into forever as they waited, each lost in their own prayers and memories. Then, so slight it might have been imagination, Danny's fingers twitched against Faith's palm. She gasped, gripping his hand tighter.
Daddy?
Her voice trembled with hope.
I felt it. His hand moved.
The others crowded closer as Faith leaned forward, her free hand brushing Danny's cheek. "Come back to me, Daddy," she whispered again. "Please, come back to me." Golden morning light streamed through the hospital window like liquid honey, casting warm, dancing patches across the sterile white linoleum floor. The steady rhythm of monitors filled the quiet room with their electronic lullaby as Danny's eyes fluttered open, heavy lids working against the brightness that seemed to pierce straight through to his brain. His body felt weighted down, as if he was trying to swim through thick molasses, every muscle protesting even the smallest movement. but the sharp, stabbing pain that had consumed him before had mercifully dulled to a manageable ache that pulsed with each heartbeat. Faith was curled up in the vinyl chair beside his bed, her honey-blonde hair falling like a curtain across her face as she slept. She had pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small in the oversized hospital furniture. She looked so much like her mother in that moment. The same delicate features, the same peaceful expression in sleep, that Danny's heart squeezed painfully in his chest. A different kind of ache altogether. A thin hospital blanket that someone had draped over her shoulders had slipped down around her waist, and her thick chemistry textbook lay open on her lap, pages bent where she had dozed off while studying. Even here, even while keeping vigil, she was trying to stay on top of her schoolwork. "Welcome back, sir." The soft voice drifted. From the corner where Commander Henderson sat in another uncomfortable chair, a gentle smile creasing his weathered face. Hawk looked bone-tired but unmistakably relieved, his usual rigid military bearing softened by genuine warmth and concern. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his uniform was more wrinkled than Danny had ever seen it. Danny tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. The words came out as nothing more than a raspy croak. Hawk immediately reached for a plastic cup of water with a bent straw and held it carefully to Danny's lips, supporting his head with practiced ease. After a few small sips that felt like heaven against his parched throat, Danny managed to whisper hoarsely, "How long?" "2 days," Hawk replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as he glanced protectively toward Faith's sleeping form. "You had us worried there for a while, sir. Touch and go for the first night. But the doctors say you'll make a full recovery. Couple of broken ribs, mild concussion, some nasty bruising, but nothing time and rest won't heal." Danny's eyes drifted back to Faith, taking in the exhaustion written in every line of her small frame. Even in sleep, one of her hands was stretched toward his bed, fingers curled as if reaching for him. "She's been here the whole time?" "Wouldn't leave your side," Hawk confirmed, his voice carrying a note of deep admiration. "Not for more than a few minutes at a time. Reverend Harper had to practically drag her down to the cafeteria to get some food in her." "She's got your stubborn streak, sir, and then some." A small smile tugged at the corners of Danny's lips despite the pain. "That she does. Gets it from both sides, I'm afraid." The door opened slowly, with a soft whoosh, and Mike Keller stepped into the room, like a man walking to his own judgment. He looked completely different from the angry young soldier of just days before. His shoulders were bowed under some invisible weight, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow from sleepless nights. When he saw that Danny was awake and alert, he froze in the doorway as if struck by lightning, raw emotion washing over his face like a tide. "Sir," he said, his voice rough and uncertain. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to find words that seemed to stick in his throat like broken glass. Danny watched him carefully, seeing past the uniform and the wounded soldier to something deeper. In Mike's face, he could see echoes of the little boy in the photos Marcus used to carry everywhere, pulling them out with such pride to show off his son's latest achievement. The son his best friend had loved more than his own life, more than anything in this world. Mike moved closer to the bed with hesitant steps, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides as if he was fighting some internal battle. Tears welled in his dark eyes, making them shine in the morning light as he finally found his voice. "I spent years hating you," he confessed, each word seeming to cost him dearly. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of pain. "Years. I convinced myself you abandoned my father out there, that his death was your fault because it was easier than accepting the truth. I needed someone to blame for the hole in my life. And you weren't there to defend yourself." Danny's chest tightened with a familiar grip of old grief, that constant companion he'd carried for so long. "Mike, I'm so sorry." "No," Mike cut him off, shaking his head firmly, his voice growing stronger. "Don't apologize. Please. You have nothing to be sorry for. I was wrong. So completely, utterly wrong." He drew a shaky breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul. When we were trapped in that avalanche, when you used your own body to shield me from those falling rocks. His voice broke slightly. I remembered something my dad wrote in his last letter home. Mike pulled a worn, creased piece of paper from his breast pocket, handling it like the precious thing it was. The edges were soft from years of folding and unfolding, and Danny could see faded ink bleeding through from the other side. He said, "My commander, my brother Danny. He's the kind of man who'd die to save any one of us without thinking twice. That's why we'd follow him anywhere, into any hell." I was just a kid when I first read that. I didn't understand then what he meant, but I do now. God help me. I understand now. Tears slid freely down Mike's cheeks as he continued, his voice thick with emotion. You tried to save him that day, didn't you? Just like you saved me. Just like you saved those families in the avalanche. Danny's own eyes grew wet, the familiar burn of tears he'd held back for too long. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. I tried, son. God knows I tried with everything I had. He was my brother, Mike, not by blood, but in every way that mattered, in every way that counts. Mike's shoulders shook as years of buried grief finally found their way to the surface. I know that now. I've been carrying this anger for so long it became part of me. But watching you risk everything for those families, for me, for people you barely knew. He straightened slowly, squaring his shoulders in a motion that was pure military precision, and raised his hand in a crisp, perfect salute. You already paid whatever debt you thought you owed, sir. You gave me back my life. And more than that, you gave me back my father's memory the way it should be. The young SEAL's voice softened to an almost reverent whisper, each word carefully chosen. Permission to call you Lieutenant Shadow again, sir? The simple question carried the weight of forgiveness, of healing, of a bridge rebuilt across years of pain and misunderstanding. It was an offering of trust, of respect, earned through sacrifice. Danny's vision blurred with tears as he looked at Marcus's son, no longer a stranger, consumed by bitterness and blame, but family found again in the most unexpected place. A small movement in his peripheral vision caught their attention. Faith had woken during their conversation and was watching them both with wide, tear-filled eyes. She hadn't moved from her curled position, but her hand had found her father's, holding it tight as she witnessed this moment of redemption unfold. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks, and her lips moved in what might have been a prayer of gratitude. Danny looked at Mike again, seeing both the shadow of his old friend Marcus and the strong, honorable man Mike had become despite his pain. His voice was thick with emotion when he finally replied, the words coming from the deepest part of his heart, "Only if you let me call you son." The words hung in the air like a prayer answered, like grace made manifest in a sterile hospital room on a sunny morning. Faith's quiet sobs of joy joined the steady beeping of the monitors, creating a symphony of healing that seemed to fill every corner of the small space. It was a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal with time and love, that forgiveness could bridge the widest chasms, and that sometimes God's greatest gifts came wrapped in storm clouds and second chances, disguised as trials, that were actually doorways to something beautiful. The morning sun painted the Tennessee hills in warm golden hues as people gathered on the gravel driveway of the Rhodes family home. Pickup trucks and cars lined the narrow country road, and neighbors stood in clusters, sharing hushed conversations and curious glances. Children darted between adults, their laughter carrying on the crisp winter breeze. Danny Rhodes stood on his front porch, leaning slightly on a wooden cane. His ribs were still tender from the avalanche, but the doctors had cleared him to return home 3 days ago. Faith stayed close to his side, her hand resting protectively on his arm. "Dad," she whispered, "what's everyone doing here?" Danny shook his head, equally mystified. "Not sure, sweetheart. Reverend Harper just said to expect company after Sunday service. Commander Henderson's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. Lieutenant Rhodes. He stood at attention near the barn, dressed in his formal Navy uniform. The other SEALs flanked him, including Mike Keller, all in their dress blues. "If you'll follow me, sir," Hawk continued, gesturing toward the barn, "we have something to show you." The crowd parted as Danny made his way down the porch steps, Faith supporting him. The gravel crunched under their feet as they approached the barn's wide doors. Hawk nodded to his men, and they pulled the doors open with ceremonial precision. There, gleaming in the morning light, stood Danny's old yellow school bus. Except it wasn't old anymore. The dents had been smoothed out, the rust removed, and the paint job was immaculate. Near the driver's window, in elegant navy blue letters, was stenciled a single word: shadow. Danny stopped in his tracks, his breath catching. The bus looked brand new, its chrome trim polished to a mirror shine. The windows sparkled, and even the tires had been replaced. "We couldn't let you keep driving these mountain roads in that old rust bucket," Hawk said, his voice warm. The whole team pitched in. Mike here did most of the mechanical work. Mike stepped forward, his posture straight, but his expression soft. "Consider it a thank you, sir, for everything." The crowd pressed closer as Reverend Harper made her way to the front. Her gray hair caught the sunlight as she raised her hands for attention. The murmuring ceased. "Friends and neighbors," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering, "we're here today to honor a man who has served this community in more ways than most of us knew. A man who traded one uniform for another, but never stopped protecting those in need." She turned to Danny, her eyes twinkling. "The good book tells us that true service isn't about glory or recognition. It's about the quiet dedication that asks for nothing in return." Danny Rhodes exemplifies this truth every day, whether he's wearing the uniform of a Navy SEAL or the simple clothes of a bus driver. Some might see driving a school bus as a step down from commanding elite warriors, but I see it differently. Every morning, Danny carries our most precious cargo, our children, through these mountains. He knows every curve, every dangerous spot, every child's name and story. That's not just driving. That's protecting. That's serving. Danny bowed his head, emotion tightening his throat. Faith squeezed his arm gently. The word shadow, now painted on this bus, Reverend Harper continued, represents more than a military code name. It represents the countless unseen acts of service that make our community stronger. The hidden battles fought in quiet hearts. The silent courage that keeps going when the path is hard. Commander Henderson stepped forward. "Lieutenant Rhodes," he called out formally, front and center. Despite his cane, Danny straightened instinctively, muscle memory from years of service taking over. He moved forward, Faith helping him stand steady. The SEALs formed a line and, as one, snapped to attention. Their salutes were precise, perfect, a gesture of deepest respect from warrior to warrior. Danny returned their salute, his movements deliberate and dignified. When he lowered his hand, his voice was rough with emotion. "This honor, it's not just mine to accept. I dedicate it to every soul who carries the weight of the unseen wars, to those who serve in uniform and those who serve without one, to the fallen who taught us the meaning of sacrifice, and to the living who keep their memory alive." His eyes met Mike's, and understanding passed between them. The younger man nodded slightly, his father's memory, a bridge rather than a barrier between them now. The crowd broke into applause as Hawk handed Danny the new keys to his bus. The metal felt warm in his palm, familiar yet different, like his old life and new one merged into something stronger. Faith wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug, careful of his healing ribs. "I'm so proud of you, Daddy," she whispered. Danny held his daughter close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, the same kind Emily used to use. The moment felt complete, wrapped in love and acceptance. Behind them, the bus engine turned over with a smooth, healthy purr. Mike had started it up to show off his handiwork. The sound filled the air with promise, ready for whatever journey came next. Spring bloomed across the Tennessee hills, painting the landscape in soft greens and bursts of wildflowers. The old bus depot, transformed into the Shadows Rest Veterans Center, stood proudly at the edge of town. Fresh white paint covered its walls and American flags flanked the entrance, gently swaying in the morning breeze. Danny Rhodes straightened the welcome sign, his weathered hands moving with careful precision. The morning sun warmed his face as he unlocked the front door, the familiar scent of coffee and pine cleaner greeting him. Inside, Faith hummed softly while arranging fresh flowers on the reception desk. Her mother's touch, evident in the way she made every corner feel like home. "Morning, Dad," she said, smoothing her sundress. Mike called. "He's bringing in 2 new veterans today." Danny nodded, his eyes crinkling with a gentle smile. "Good. Did you set up the back room for group?" "All ready, and I made extra coffee." Faith's eyes sparkled, the strong kind, like you had on the bus that night. The center had become their shared mission, a testament to healing that grew from that snowy encounter 3 months ago. The SEALs had insisted on funding it, calling it payback for services rendered. But Danny knew it was more than that. It was a bridge between his past and present, a way to serve without the weight of a uniform. By mid-morning, the center buzzed with activity. Veterans of different ages filled the comfortable chairs in the main room, some talking quietly, others simply finding peace in the presence of those who understood. Danny moved among them with quiet authority, his presence both commanding and gentle. An older Vietnam veteran named George sat in his usual corner, hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "Lieutenant," he called out, using Danny's old title with respect. "Got a minute?" Danny pulled up a chair, noting the tremor in George's hands. "Always got time, brother." "The nightmares came back last night," George whispered, his voice rough. "Thought I was past all that." Danny leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Healing isn't linear, George. Some days we climb mountains, others we just need to breathe." He reached for his worn Bible on the nearby table. "Mind if we pray together?" George nodded, and Danny's quiet words filled the space between them with hope and understanding. The afternoon brought Mike Keller, now a regular presence at the center. He led 2 young veterans through the door, their postures rigid with unspoken tension. Danny watched as Mike guided them to the meditation garden out back, his own transformation evident in the gentle way he spoke to them. Mike told them, echoing words Danny had once shared with him, "is learning to lay down your weapons and pick up peace instead." Faith worked at her desk, scheduling appointments and coordinating with local churches and support services. She'd grown into her role naturally, her compassion drawing out stories from even the most reserved visitors. The wall behind her displayed photos of their extended family, the SEALs who now regularly visited, bringing both wisdom and laughter to the center. Commander Hawk stopped by weekly, often bringing new recruits to learn from Danny's experience. Today, he sat in on the afternoon group session, watching as Danny led discussions about transition, trauma, and trust. "The uniform comes off," Danny told the group, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But the brotherhood doesn't. We carry each other's burdens, share each other's victories. That's what this place is about." The veterans nodded, recognition and relief crossing their faces. One young Marine, fresh from his first tour, wiped tears from his eyes. "Sir," he said, "I thought I was alone in this." "You're never alone here, son," Danny replied, the words coming from deep within his heart. As afternoon faded into evening, Mike helped Danny organize the day's paperwork. They worked in comfortable silence until Mike spoke up. "You know what my dad would say about all this?" He gestured to the center around them. Danny paused, emotions flickering across his face. "He'd be proud," Mike continued, his voice soft but certain. "Of both of us." Danny squeezed Mike's shoulder. words unnecessary between them. The burden they'd once carried had transformed into a bridge of understanding. Faith poked her head into the office. Reverend Harper called. "He's adding us to Sunday's prayer list. Says we're doing God's work here." "We're just passing on what we've learned," Danny replied humbly. As the day drew to a close, the last visitors filed out with lighter steps and stronger spirits. Faith hugged her father goodbye, heading to her evening volunteer work at the church. Mike locked up the back rooms, his keys jingling in the quiet space. Danny stood in the doorway, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. The same mountains that had witnessed his transformation from Lieutenant Shadow to bus driver, and now to this, a healer of hidden wounds, a guardian of broken spirits. He pulled out his keys, their familiar weight grounding him in the present moment. The sign above the crowned door caught the last rays of sunlight, casting a warm glow on the words, "Shadows Rest." Looking toward the mountains that had seen so much of his journey, Danny whispered softly, "We made it. Emily." The evening breeze carried his words up toward the darkening sky, and for a moment, he felt her presence in the peace that filled his heart. The August sun hung heavy in the Tennessee sky, casting long shadows across the road's farmhouse porch. Cardboard boxes and suitcases lined the wooden railing, each one labeled in Faith's neat handwriting. Danny stood in the doorway, watching his daughter pack the last of her belongings into her used Honda Civic. His heart swelled with pride even as it ached with the impending goodbye. "Dad, have you seen my social work textbooks?" Faith called out, her long brown hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She wore her mother's old college sweater, the sleeves rolled up against the late summer heat. "Check the kitchen table," Danny replied, his voice steady, despite the emotion building in his chest. "Right next to your acceptance letter." Faith darted inside, her footsteps echoing through the house they'd shared for 17 years. She found the books and hugged them to her chest, pausing to look at the family photos on the wall. There was one of her mother, Emily, pregnant and glowing. Next to it hung a newer addition, the whole team from Shadows Rest, with Mike Keller standing proud beside Danny. "You know," Danny said softly, coming up behind her, "your mother would have loved seeing you follow this path. Social work, helping veterans' families." He cleared his throat. "She always said you had a heart bigger than the mountains." Faith turned and wrapped her arms around her father, the books pressed between them. "I learned from the best, Dad. You and Mom both." The screen door creaked open as Reverend Harper arrived, carrying her famous peach cobbler. "I hope I'm not too early for dinner," she called out, her silver hair catching the evening light. "Never too early for your cobbler, Reverend." Danny smiled, taking the dish from her hands. The sweet aroma filled the kitchen, mixing with the pot roast already simmering on the stove. Soon, the rumble of vehicles announced the arrival of the Seals. Hawk's truck pulled up first, followed by Mike's Jeep. They carried gifts wrapped in simple brown paper, practical things for Faith's dorm room. The kitchen quickly filled with familiar voices and laughter. Danny watched as Faith moved among them, touching shoulders, offering drinks, making sure everyone felt welcome, just like her mother used to do. Mike helped her serve the food, their old antagonism long since transformed into a brotherly affection. To Faith, Hawk raised his glass once everyone was seated. Who proves that the strongest warriors don't always wear uniforms? To Faith, everyone echoed, making her blush. "You know," Reverend Harper said between bites of pot roast, "I remember when you first came to town, Danny. So closed off, carrying such heavy burdens." She smiled warmly at Faith. "But this child of yours, she opened hearts like flowers to the sun." Mike nodded, his eyes serious. "The center wouldn't be what it is without her. Those kids of veterans who come in, scared and angry like I was, Faith knows exactly how to reach them. Danny watched his daughter duck her head modestly, but he could see the quiet confidence in her shoulders. She'd grown into a young woman who understood that healing came in many forms, that sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply showing up for others. "I just want to help families like ours," Faith said softly. "Dad taught me that the wounds of war don't end when the fighting stops. They ripple through generations unless someone stands in the gap with love." Danny felt tears prick his eyes. All those years of questioning whether he'd done right by her, whether his broken pieces had damaged her somehow. And here she sat, turning those very struggles into a mission of mercy. The conversation flowed late into the evening, stories weaving together like a tapestry of shared lives. Faith listened intently as the Seals shared memories of their own college days, their eyes bright with nostalgia and hope for her future. As the stars emerged and their guests began to leave, each one hugged Faith tightly. Reverend Harper blessed her with gentle words about God's guidance. Hawk slipped her an envelope containing emergency funds, just in case. Mike gave her a satellite phone, muttering something about keeping in touch with her old guard. Later, after the house had quieted, Danny found Faith sitting on the porch swing, looking at the mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "Scared?" he asked, settling beside her. "A little," she admitted, "but good scared. Like when you know you're exactly where you're supposed to be, even though it's hard." Danny nodded, understanding completely. "That's how I felt every morning, driving that bus. Never thought I'd find my calling behind a steering wheel, but God has his ways." They swayed gently in the warm night air, sharing the comfortable silence that had always been part of their bond. Tomorrow would bring change, but tonight was for savoring the moment. "Dad?" Faith's voice was thoughtful. "Remember when you used to tell me that true strength isn't about being tough, but about staying soft in a hard world?" "I remember. I think that's your real legacy. Not the missions or the medals, but how you showed us all that healing is possible, that it's okay to need help, that love wins in the end." Danny wrapped his arm around her shoulders, unable to speak, past the lump in his throat. His daughter had become his greatest teacher, showing him that redemption wasn't earned through penance, but found in the daily choice to love well. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Faith's car sat loaded in the driveway, ready for the journey ahead. Danny helped her with the last few items, his movements deliberate and careful, stretching out these final moments. Standing on the porch, he watched her check her mirrors and adjust her seat. She rolled down the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears and excitement. Danny straightened his back and raised his hand in a playful salute, his voice barely above a whisper. Another soldier for kindness. The winter sun hadn't yet risen over the Tennessee mountains as Danny Rhodes warmed up his old yellow school bus. A year had passed since that fateful snowstorm that changed everything, but the morning routine remained sacred. He checked the gauges, tested the wipers, and adjusted his mirror with the same careful precision he'd learned in the Navy. The bus looked different now. Besides shadow stenciled near the driver's window, a small sign read, "Veterans Welcome. Mobile Counseling. Available." The back seats had been converted into a cozy sitting area with comfortable chairs and a coffee maker. It wasn't fancy, but it served its purpose. Danny hummed an old gospel tune as he guided the bus along the winding mountain roads. The familiar route felt different these days, lighter somehow. The weight of secrets and guilt no longer pressed down on his shoulders like it used to. Each stop held the possibility of both dropping kids off at school and helping a veteran find their way back to peace. The sky was just beginning to purple with dawn when he spotted a figure at the next stop. A young man in crisp military fatigue stood straight-backed in the cold, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Danny recognized that stance, NES, the perfect posture masking uncertainty underneath. He'd seen it countless times before, both in the mirror and in the faces of young recruits. The doors whooshed open with a gentle hiss. "Morning," Danny said warmly. "Heading into town?" The young man nodded, climbing aboard with measured steps. He couldn't have been more than 19, with close-cropped hair and anxious eyes that darted around the empty bus. His name tape read, "Phillips, take any seat you like," Danny offered. "Coffee's hot in the back, if you're interested." Phillips hesitated, then moved toward the rear of the bus where the counseling area was set up. Danny waited until they were moving again before speaking. "Shipping out soon?" he asked quietly, watching the young man's reflection in the rearview mirror. "Yes, sir." "Next week?" Phillips's voice cracked slightly. "First deployment." Danny nodded, remembering his own first deployment. The mix of pride and terror, the weight of responsibility settling onto shoulders too young to fully understand it. "It's okay to be nervous," he said. "Anyone who tells you different is either lying or foolish." The young man's shoulders slumped slightly, as if relieved to hear someone finally acknowledge what he was feeling. "Everyone keeps telling me how proud they are," he admitted, "how brave I am. But sometimes I wake up at night wondering if I'm good enough, strong enough." Danny guided the bus around a gentle curve, giving the words space to settle. "You know what real strength is?" he asked after a moment. "It's not about never being afraid. It's about moving forward anyway. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones no one sees." Phillips looked up sharply, meeting Danny's eyes in the mirror. "The invisible ones," he said softly. "That's right." Danny smiled. "The ones we fight in here." He tapped his chest. "Those are the ones that matter most." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the sun slowly painting the hills gold. Danny thought about how far he'd come in the past year, from hiding his past to using it to help others. The Veterans Center in town was thriving, and this mobile counseling route had become a lifeline for many. Mike Keller still visited regularly, their bond stronger than ever. "Sir?" Phillips's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "The sign says you do. Counseling. Are you? Were you?" "Lieutenant Daniel Rhodes," Danny said. "Navy SEALs. Retired. Though these days most people just call me Danny." Recognition flickered across the young man's face. "Lieutenant Shadow? I've heard stories about you at base. They say you saved an entire SEAL team in last year's blizzard." Danny chuckled. "The story gets bigger every time I hear it. Truth is, we saved each other that day. Taught me that sometimes God sends us into storms, not just to help others, but to help ourselves." The bus crested a hill, revealing the valley below shrouded in morning mist. Danny checked his mirror again, studying his reflection. Gray streaked his temples now, and laugh lines had deepened around his eyes. But there was peace there too, the kind that comes from walking through fire and finding purpose in the ashes. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "my daughter Faith told me something before she left for college that stuck with me. She said every morning we wake up is another chance to serve, uniform or not. We just have to be willing to love people through their storms." Phillips nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his young face. "Like you're doing now, with this bus?" "Something like that," Danny smiled. "Though I think this old bus does most of the work. She's got a way of bringing people together when they need it most." The first snowflakes of the morning began to fall, soft and gentle, against the windshield. Danny watched them dance in the headlights, remembering another snowy morning when Grace had found him through the storm. The bus hummed steadily forward, carrying its precious cargo of hope and healing into the misty dawn. In his mind, he could hear Faith's voice clear as day. "Dad always said you don't need a uniform to serve. You just need to love people through the storm." The snow fell harder now, but Danny wasn't worried. He knew these roads by heart, just as he knew the path of redemption that had led him here. The bus disappeared into the swirling white, a yellow beacon of hope in the Tennessee hills. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel Danny Rhodes, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.